Listen to some stuff, you know, I just didn't want to sit at home.
Why?
Well, I didn't feel like it.
What time did you hear the news?
This morning sometime.
Very early?
Yeah. Don't know, yeah? A drag, isn't it? Okay, cheers.
Come on.
Hello, guys.
The survivor of the most successful songwriting team in history also said John will be remembered for his unique contribution to art, music, and world peace. Another former Beatle, George Harrison, was said to be in a state of shock at his secluded mansion in the English countryside. In London, as in record stores all over Europe, copies of Lennon's latest recording were in heavy demand. Fans said they wanted a last memento to add to their collections of the rebellious, angry young musician of the 60s. All over the world today, newspapers and radio and television programs gave special, sustained coverage to Lennon's death. From Madrid to Moscow, the murder was condemned, and with it, by implication, American society. London's New Standard editorialized, Lennon's meaningless murder is increasingly typical of New York and the United States in general, where the freedom to carry guns has brought forth monsters. In TV studios as well as the streets, individuals were angry and bitter.
His music will live forever, and because of this stupid piece of refuse that's done this to him, who might get away with it because that's the way the law is. I mean, because I would be very adamant this man must be killed for me.
It's America's to blame. We should have got out of America a long time ago. It's a society like America that these things can happen. Very shocked.
I think it's disgusting. It could only happen in America, couldn't it? You should have stayed here. That's all I can say.
A parking lot in Liverpool now marks the spot where it all started. The city that gave birth to the Beatles was in shock and mourning today. Just yesterday, radio listeners all over Britain heard John Lennon say in an interview, "While there's life, there's hope." John Lawrence, ABC News, London.
Well, in this nation, President-elect Reagan, who called Lennon's death a great tragedy, said in New York today, "We have to find a way to stop such violence in the streets." But Reagan said he still does not believe gun control is the answer. President Carter said he's saddened by Lennon's death and distressed by the senseless manner of it. In his statement, the president said Lennon's greatest success came when the Beatles, in his words, conquered America. Well, today those conquered remembered and mourned. Stephen Gear has that story.
I give her all my love, that's all I do.
In an electronic age, it is the image of John Lennon that Americans are mourning. His recorded voice and the voices of his fellow Beatles were broadcast again and again today from radio stations across the nation. And stations broadcast an outpouring of grief in the form of comments from their listeners.
It's just unbelievable how this could happen. And I'd just like to say I'm on my way to New York right now to be with his spirit, as close as I can be to John's spirit.
In Los Angeles and other cities, disc jockeys asked motorists to turn on their headlights in memory of John Lennon. And here in Los Angeles, someone with a spray can of paint left this remembrance on a bus. Some of those who had known John Lennon the man went on television to talk about him.
John Lennon was one of the people who helped older people understand that war was not a nice thing.
At Taft High School in Woodland Hills, California, students, almost too young to remember the Beatles, met to remember John Lennon.
Yoko sits alone now, without a life, of course, because someone confused him out and has used deadly force.
There were crowds today at record stores everywhere in the country, crowds of people somewhat older than those who usually buy the bulk of popular recordings. They came to buy Beatles records and the newer recordings of John Lennon, whose career had been revitalized by a successful new album. The violent manner of Lennon's death reminded some of the most significant incident of violence in their young lives.
John Lennon's death reminded me of when I heard that Kennedy was killed when I was a little girl.
And some cried because a man was senselessly killed, a man with a very familiar image. Stephen Gear, ABC News, Los Angeles.
Lennon's wife, Yoko Ono, said in a statement this afternoon there will be no funeral service for her husband. Instead, she will set a time later this week for all his friends and fans to pray for his soul. "We will invite you to participate from wherever you are at the time," said Yoko Ono, adding, "John loved and prayed for the human race. Please pray the same for him." Well, still ahead, John Lennon's musical legacy in a special report by Geraldo Rivera and the latest from Poland.
You know Iron Curtain. John Lennon's death leaves his many fans in the Soviet bloc saddened. Polish television tonight reported the details of his murder, and so did other Eastern European countries. By and large, the days are gone when the Beatles' music was considered counter-revolutionary, a real example of the decadent West. Max?
John Lennon leaves an estate estimated at more than $250 million. But his real legacy, of course, is his music, said one of his millions of fans mourning Lennon's death today. When he said, "I want to hold your hand," I knew he was talking about my generation. Geraldo Rivera has this special report.
Together over me, and this evening that's exactly what millions of music fans around the world are doing, joined in mourning the death of John Lennon, one of the most important musicians of our time. He was a person of boundless energy and seemingly unlimited talent. Along with Paul McCartney, Lennon was the real cornerstone of the group that, in the early 60s, began a musical evolution. The Beatles were a force that overwhelmed the world of rock and roll and affected the attitudes and style of a whole generation.
Ringo, Paul, George, John. The Beatles.
Their appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964 was an event we still remember. They were the heirs of Elvis Presley and the inspiration for everything in rock music that's come after them. John and Paul wrote most of the songs that sold more than 250 million records in all, records that continue to sell 11 years after the group broke up.
I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we pass the audition.
The Beatles had done it with style and a sense of both humor and history. But by 1970, the group went through its last evolution. Despite their own lyrics, after the group broke up, the Lennons did begin trying to change the world. By then, they were inseparable, living in the United States and active in fighting for everything from women's rights to ending the war in Vietnam. It got them both in trouble, and when I first met them in 1972, they were fighting deportation from the country. The announced reason for the government action was John's obscure arrest in England in 1968 for the possession of marijuana. But John thought the government had other motives.
The other official reason is that I was bussed in England for pot. And the real reason is because I'm a peacenik.
Because they were so totally involved in social change, I managed to coax the Lennons out of retirement to do this benefit concert for the mentally retarded. It earned $160,000 for the cause. After 5 more years spent again in relative seclusion and enduring personal crisis, the Lennons reemerged recently. John even did a radio interview to talk about himself and his philosophy.
We're either going to live or we're going to die. If we're dead, we'll have to deal with that. If we're alive, we've got to deal with being alive.
ABC News, New York.
John Lennon, Mark David Chapman, is arraigned on murder charges in New York. We'll have more on the John Lennon shooting and the related issue of gun control tonight on Nightline. That's the news. This is Ted Koppel for the vacationing Frank Reynolds and all of us at ABC News. Good evening.